At the turn of the century, the motor car's development mainly concerned speed. Scarcely had man developed petrol-driven cars than he began to race them. In those heroic old days, it wasn't a sport that was money-orientated. Early racing drivers were gentlemen fascinated by technical progress and amateur sportsmen who liked to take risks, like the famously bearded aristocrat René de Knif or the Count of Chasseloup-Laubat. Or else they were pioneers of the motor industry, eager to show off the capabilities of their products, such as the Renault brothers, Fritz von Opel, Émile Levasseur, the Dion and Bouton, the Michelin brothers, and later Vincenzo Lancia. It was the Elite Automobile Club de France which eventually turned the sport into an international confrontation. Teams came from manufacturers, the cars driven by their employees, who worked as mechanics, engineers or test drivers during the week and became racing drivers on Sundays. Thus began Enzo Ferrari's career at Alfa Romeo. The racing motorist earned prize money and wages, but racing at this time was simply a way of improving an employee's status while satisfying his will to race. The Grand Prix driver of the first 2 decades was more like a sort of motorized Ben-Hur, who risked his life in this dangerous sport for the greater glory of his country and employer, rather than to make his fortune. These early racing motorists also went in search of records. In 1929, Henry Seagrave reached 230 mph driving Golden Arrow for the honor of his country. Gradually, however, motor racing was moving from the open road to closed circuits. Thus, it became a spectacle in its own right, and the driving aces vied with jockeys and boxers as heroic sportsmen of a golden age. Professionals entered the scene, and the manufacturers fought for their services, although not with very high wages. The stars of the 30s, however, were still risking their lives by racing, and their reward was more often an accident than wealth. Few of them, however, made their living by racing, and Grand Prix fields were completed largely by wealthy amateurs. We had already reached the era of gentlemen drivers and professionals. It was the same in record breaking. The gentlemen drivers, Sir Malcolm Campbell and then John Cobb, both broke the 500 kph barrier in 1938. In Grand Prix racing, it was the organisers who ran the show. Entrants were invited to race, but a turning point came in 1950 with the creation of a Formula One World Championship, where competitors were invited to participate in a series of events. This process didn't guarantee a fee, and it didn't overcome haggling over money. In fact, the organisers allotted each competitor start money, which varied depending on the driver's fame, plus a contribution to travelling expenses, each entrant receiving his own fee, or as good a fee as he could bargain for. Of course, it was the big teams, such as Alfa Romeo and Mercedes, who profited most from this arrangement, even though they weren't racing for the money. The little teams, mainly British in the early 50s, who made up the bulk of the field, had to make do with what was left. This was particularly meagre, as the unprofessional organisers played upon the budgetary difficulties which made them look mean. Thus was born the practice of running start money specials. A team would run 2 cars. The most competitive would be for the #1 driver, while the second car was only intended to do a few laps in order to earn its start money. That, however, plus contracts signed with fuel companies and automobile equipment manufacturers, constituted the only earnings for a team right up to the end of the 60s. With the exception of 1 or 2 of the more affluent of teams, most had trouble balancing their budgets. At the beginning of the 70s, an English entrepreneur, Bernie Eccleston, came on the scene. Having bought the Brabham team, he then suggested to his fellow team owners that they should get together to present a unified front to the organisers. Thus was born the Formula One Constructors Association, or FOCA, which would make its members their fortune by putting the Grand Prix house in order.
You just need to be competing for 1 year and shown to be doing a sensible job and apply for membership. And there's no particular advantage in being a member of FOCA. All the teams get the same benefits financially. It's the club that's been going a long time, and you know, we try to steer, and hopefully between us when we meet, we do something which we think is not good for each individual, and we don't make politics for each individual team. We try to do something that's good for Formula One racing.
Out of the limelight, the 70s were notable for the irresistible rise in power of FOCA, who, having knocked the organisers into shape, would now replace them as being the most influential body in Grand Prix racing. As the governing body was badly structured and without any apparent authority, FOCA, efficient and active, began to take a bigger and bigger slice of the Grand Prix cake, gradually taking control of Formula One. However, the election of a president determined to exercise his power as head of the governing body, FISA, changed everything.
Le sport automobile international se trouvait sous la tutelle d'une commission de la Fédération internationale automobile. J'ai été nommé en 1976 vice-président de la commission sportive internationale. Et j'ai découvert très vite, en quelques mois, qu'elle était sous le contrôle de lobbies de constructeurs, sous certaines influences germaniques notamment à l'époque, qui faussaient les règlements, qui mettaient en place des règlements dans l'intérêt de certains constructeurs de certains pays. J'ai marqué ma désapprobation en démissionnant bruyamment de ma vice-présidence internationale. Et c'est ainsi qu'à Melbourne, à l'Assemblée générale de la FIA, nous avons créé la FISA, la Fédération internationale du sport automobile, qui a bénéficié d'un statut d'autonomie à l'intérieur de la FIA.
Balestre wanted to assert his authority and put down FOCA. From that moment on, conflict was inevitable.
Tout le contrôle du championnat de Formule 1 était entre les mains de M. Ecclestone et de la FOCA. Pourquoi? À cause du vide de l'autorité sportive internationale, à cause de l'absence de pouvoir sportif international. Et le conflit, la grande guerre qui est intervenue dans les années 81-82 entre la FISA et la FOCA, c'est parce que nous avons exigé la reprise en main par nous-mêmes du pouvoir et de l'autorité.
We wanted a governing body that would govern the sport, because we were becoming, if you like, commercial. We were writing the rules, we were our own judge and jury and everything else, and it was extremely difficult. So, and then the president was a little ambitious, and he thought perhaps he should look after the commercial side as well as the sport, in which we didn't think was right.
Tension mounted, and the first confrontation erupted in 1980. Renault, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo had begun to use turbocharged engines, but the FOCA teams, mainly British, were still using the much cheaper, normally aspirated Ford Cosworth engines. But the latter were less competitive than the turbos. The FOCA teams wanted to ban the turbos, whose supporters had FISA on their side. In order to compensate for the relative lack of power, the Cosworth users used their chassis expertise to discover ground effect, which they were the first to master. But the drivers were alarmed by the physical effects of this phenomena, which so increased grip and therefore cornering speeds, and put pressure on FISA, who banned the sliding skirts, which were so vital to ground effect. FOCA had been defeated.
The big constructors were Renault and Ferrari could see that if they sided in with the federation, they may get the rules written to suit them. If you remember, it was the time of the turbo coming in and things like that. And they were looking for an edge in the rules to suit them. So that if we side in with the federation, we're going to get the rules written against those terrible English people.
Defying FISA, FOCA announced their intention to create a breakaway championship, and to prove that this was no idle threat, they organised their first race in South Africa at the start of the 1981 season, and all their teams duly attended. Balestre was furious. He wanted revenge. Formula One, however, was threatened by a split which could only be harmful. So Renault, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo deserted FISA's president and negotiated a compromise. After all, they needed respected competitors if their participation was to be credible. Ballest was beaten. Goodbye to his dream of total control.
Ça a duré 5 minutes d'ailleurs. Nous avons établi un gentleman's agreement, qui respecte les positions de chaque partie, c'est-à-dire la partie commerciale était pour lui et pour les constructeurs, les pilotes, etc., et les organisateurs, bien sûr, et l'aspect sportif avec des redevances normales, sous le contrôle de la Fédération internationale. Et c'est un document qui s'appelle l'accord Concorde, que nous avons mis au point avec 8 juristes de 3 nationalités dans nos bureaux. Les négociations ont duré 29 jours. 29 jours non-stop. Ce document, d'ailleurs, a résisté à l'épreuve du temps, puisque maintenant, il existe depuis 11 ans, et ça a toujours été la Bible, l'évangile du championnat du monde de Formule 1.
Faces were saved, but the two protagonists had their memories and ambitions of leadership. Even so, the affair brought together Eccleston and Ballest, who learnt to his cost that the so-called legalists or manufacturers weren't quite as loyal as he had hoped. So while the FOCA teams allegedly interpreted rules, such as the minimum weight, somewhat loosely, FISA, strangely lax, turned a blind eye. Exasperated, the legalists reacted by lodging protests after the 1982 Brazilian Grand Prix. Winner Piquet and second-placed Rosberg were disqualified, which stirred the whole thing up again. Nearly all the British teams objected to this decision and boycotted the subsequent San Marino Grand Prix. Renault and Ferrari were reduced to arranging a sham of a race in order to save face in front of the public. Each side seemed intent on killing the goose that laid the golden egg, and Formula One was going with it.